in white scientific terms, the inferior races die out. And that was still prevalent. That was major theory through the 20th century, that one day Aboriginal people would die out. Terrible breakups of family. The idea was that they would get them away from the families, the elders would die off, and you'd have no more Aborigines. That was the whole plan. And that was in law.
There were people from Bihar who were taken away from Bihar, and they weren't told where they are being taken.
Yes.
And they were shipped to countries like Fiji.
The sadhu in Calcutta, who I lived with on the streets of Calcutta for a week, he was quite short, very, very stocky man. I didn't speak English very much. But he looked at me in the eyes and said, "Not father, first mother. Mother, father, master, God."
Welcome to Happy Alien Life. Today, we are diving into the captivating world of storytelling with a true visionary, Dr. Alec Morgan. With a PhD in Media and Communications, Dr. Alec has spent his life uncovering the hidden stories of Australia. What happens when Aboriginal filmmakers reclaim the history? Alec's groundbreaking research in visual songliness shows us how deeply our culture and identity are intertwined. His award-winning films like Lousy Little Sixpence challenges us to confront our past and its impact. But Alec is more than just a scholar and filmmaker. He's a force for change. He works tirelessly to return archival films into Indigenous communities, ensuring their voices are heard. His latest project, Ablaze, shines a light on untold stories that deserve to be recognized. Are you ready to be inspired by the power of film and culture? It is with great pride that I welcome Dr. Alec. Welcome to Happy Alien Life.
It's very warm here.
Yeah.
I mean, spring has arrived in an instant, so all the blossoms have come out overnight, just about.
Yeah. Does it remind you of something? Or you just simply like cold weather?
No, well, growing up, I guess, in New Zealand where it was colder, but yeah.
Where in New Zealand did you grow up?
In a place called Upper Hutt, which is north of Lower Hutt.
Is it in the North Island or the South Island?
It was near Wellington, Wellington.
Yeah, the capital.
It was near there. It was sort of north. I mean, I suppose you'd call it a very outer suburb of Wellington now. It's about 40 k's, about 30, 40 k's north, Wellington.
And when did you move to Australia?
When I was about 18, I think. So, early 70s.
So you are Kiwi.
A very different Australia in those days.
How was it? How was New Zealand, and then how was Australia when you were growing up? I mean, you moved when you were 18 years of age.
Yeah.
I don't know, do you identify yourself more as a Kiwi than Australian, or a mix of both?
Yeah. Well, I think now I'm definitely Australian. That's a long time ago, although I have very, very fond affection for the actual country. And but I don't go back as much now as I used to. But no, Australia is where I sort of have been working and living since that time, mostly. Except for a short time in England and traveling across India.
When was that?
I'm trying to remember. I was pretty young. I was about 20, 21, 70, probably 73, 74. 1973, 74, yeah. You could move then, you could travel.
And how was it? How was India at that time? That was how many years ago? Yeah, more than 30 years.
Yeah,
Around 30 years ago.
Well,
No,
50
more,
years
more,
ago.
more. Yeah, 50.
Yeah.
How was it?
It was crazy. It was very intense. I think India is the most intense country I've ever been to, particularly for people and the streets. I never, I mean, I haven't been to a huge amount of countries, but I'd say the streets of India are absolutely unique than anywhere else in the world. Intense of what happens in the actual streets of India at that time too.
So where in India were you? Which part?
In the north, because I came over because I was in Afghanistan and came through Pakistan, so I would have arrived, in New Delhi from the north, and then went across to Calcutta. At that time, it's called Calcutta, but travelled by train, sometimes third-class carriage.
How was that?
Okay. Yeah, I always remember the chai sellers coming through the window, the open window of the trade. Yeah. Chai. They're selling chai, and that was, the mental pictures are very strong of that time.
How was it to switch from, because in Australia people drink a lot of coffee compared to tea. How was it to drink tea at the time in India?
I love chai. I still drink chai. Yeah, masala chai.
And what about the food? Didn't you know how to cook Indian food?
Well, I sort of. I mean, any Indian chef would not, would be horrified. But I did when I arrived back in Sydney. Got a job as a curry chef for a small restaurant. But Indian curry in those days, because not many people went to restaurants in those times, and so Indian curry was the equivalent. Although I could cook. I had to cook for my brothers as a kid. So Indian curry there was big jars, and it was mild, medium, or hot curry. That was the title, right? And the other alternative was a big jar of vindaloo, right? So we had vindaloo pork. We probably had chicken and beef curry, and I think a vegetable curry. And I picked up making chapatis in India. So, I mean, there's plenty of, and it's very cheap. So try not to eat too many though, otherwise I put on weight quickly.
It's quite rich. Just like the culture, just like the Indian culture.
Yes.
And as a young Australian and a young Kiwi, when you were traveling to India, what did you think was so different from Australia? How was it different?
Oh, well, the countryside is very, there's an intensity to the colouring, which is similar to New Zealand. New Zealand's got, like you can see, cloud formations are very intense. And I think the countryside, when you pass through, you're coming from Afghanistan, which is very sort of grey and deserty, and then into India. So it's a very rich looking country in terms of the physical landscape. Many people, that was the difference. Because growing up in Upper Hutt and even Sydney in those days, the influence of what is multicultural Australia was not there in the way it is today. I mean, the Australia today, you wouldn't be able to compare in many ways socially to how it was back then. A lot of independent filmmakers, we were young, but we'd go to Bondi Beach because it was cheap. And Bondi Beach in those days had no cafes. It was a working class area and few people went. And there was one pizza bar. So if you go to Bondi today, you'd call me a liar, right? It's just very, very changed in the last. And that didn't really happen till the 1990s, that sort of shift where, you have massive people. You still could go to Chinatown and there were small pockets. There'd be occasionally a Greek restaurant or a Turkish restaurant or, curry was often in Crow's Nest on the North Shore. There was a few restaurants there, but it was a very different world to today.
A lot of people from the West actually have come to India and they have said that they felt very enlightened, like Steve Jobs, like the Beatles, and then they have some very spiritual experience. Did you have an experience like that?
Yes, definitely. The thing that was very different to me, and remember I had no money, right? So I was very dependent on people's generosity. And crazy young, confused young man that I was determined to find some answers to some questions. And I wasn't focused so much directly on spiritual, but the thing that was different to India was the way in which, and I started this in New Delhi. I've got photographs of it. I had enough money to go and buy, because I was always drawing, and I had enough money to buy a very cheap school book. And it was, I've still got the photo, I've still got it. And I went out every morning early before sunrise and drew people who were sleeping on the streets, because there were these kind of figures covered in blankets, and it was coming on winter. And to me, growing up in New Zealand, mostly at that time, or even in Australia, which I was for a short time, it's something that was totally different to the world that I'd come from. So in that sense, the experience of India was totally different to the world that I'd come from, where the streets you see nobody after dark. If you lived in Canberra, really up until the 21st century, you virtually couldn't find a restaurant open after dark. That's shifted and changed. So as a young man, I was very much interested in what was happening in the streets of New Delhi, and walked around New Delhi a lot, enormously.
At that time, did you fly to India, or did you take a ship to India in 1974?
No, I was actually in London. I had got into the St. Martin's School of Art, and I probably spent a year there saving money to go to art school, but decided that it wasn't where my heart was. And although I went to a lot of museums, and looked around, but I didn't feel I wanted to stay there. So I guess there was a lot of questions. And I went to Italy, to southern Italy, at a town, and helped set up a community theatre in this small village called Latiano, which was incredible. And I was going to go back to London to start the art school, but decided I wanted to see the world, I think, even though I had very little money left. But I just had a bag of change of clothing. I just headed off. I was hoping to sell, in those days to travel, you could sell your blood in Greece. And by the time I got to Greece, though, they couldn't take my blood because my blood count was down. So
really,
I just kept going. Yeah, I was fine. I was fine, but I just kept going. When you're young, kind of crazy. But so that's how I ended up in India. I travelled overland across Turkey, where I saw the Turkish Shadow Theatre, and then to Iran, and then Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and then India. And by which time it'd taken about 6 months. And then I picked up some money and flew to Thailand from there.
So that was a long journey. How many days did it take you from London to Italy to Turkey to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India?
I probably spent about a year or 9 months to a year traveling. I spent about 3 months in Afghanistan, which I found very fascinating. And, you know, to see what's happened to Afghanistan after that, and Iran as well, is just unbelievable from my impressions of Afghanistan and the way, you know, the world was in those days. But yeah, I mean, I've always been, you know, growing up in New Zealand, even though I grew up in a couple of islands in the South Pacific, a long way from there, I grew up next to a library. So although, you know, my family were builders and not necessarily readers, or it wasn't an academic family. So I learned a lot about the world from the library, and was always drawing as a child. So, you know, to see different cultures in different parts of the world was something that I was very keen to do. So that's got me to see a lot of countries that I wouldn't be able to go to now.
How did a boy who was raised in a family of builders turned into a filmmaker and a doctorate and got into the arts world?
Well, I always was doing that. I was always drawing, and my mother said that even from the age of 2, I was always in the corner reading a book and writing stories later, you know. So that was my world, and I think I have 2 elder brothers who, my father was very much an outdoors person. You know, New Zealand culture is very much about going out and shooting deer and rabbits and wildlife, or going out fishing. It's about, I was sort of an indoor child who always pretended that I was sick so I could stay home and draw and write stories. But of course I learned about art through art books at the library. You know, they would have had, they had books on different artists, Picasso, Miro, the Surrealists. It wasn't a bad library, but I was fascinated by that because I was actually doing it. So I was learning a lot by looking at these different images and books. Because we didn't have internet in those days, and you know, the only thing we really had was a cinema. But I was always fascinated by cinema as well. I loved going to the movies. We used to have 2 cinemas, one run by the same person, and you know, as kids you could go to what was called the matinee, where you saw a movie very cheap. And if we happened to be good kids, we got enough money to go on Saturday afternoon to go and see a movie. And I just loved movies. I spent as much time as I could in these movie houses. So, you know, that world was accessible, even though it was a sort of very suburban kind of township, if you like. And I used to create sort of comic books in those days for my school friends, who they loved it. And it was only later on that I found that how different I was to the rest of the township I grew up in. You know, I wasn't aware that I was being seen by my father, particularly, who was a builder and, you know, an ex sort of lifesaver, you know, rugby player, thought, you know, that very weird child that he had. He never spoke to me, but he left me alone. So it was quite a shock when they were going to close down art at the high school when I was 15, and the head teacher, who I'd actually never really met, had seen my art and gone to the National Art School and got me into the art school and recommended that I go there, even though the age of going into the art school was 18 at 15. and so it was all open that I was about to go into the National Art School at a very young age. But my father put his foot down and refused to do that. It was a dream. And the background to that is really New Zealand, like India once was a British colony. And the type of, unlike India, New Zealand was predominantly Anglo or British stock, although I wasn't, or Maori. And so that kind of, the migrants who went to New Zealand were particularly looking to own houses as they are in Australia and, build a new life. So culture was something that we didn't really have value. They had no value to a New Zealand culture. If this is in the 60s, who became our most famous writer, Janet Frame, was locked up in a psychiatric hospital because she was different. And there was no artist that I knew of in New Zealand at that time. I only learned later on that was an artist living quite close to where we used to have a stay near a beach. But she was unknown, and art was seen as something that, the British, Britain had the culture and Europe had the culture. And so therefore there was no worth given to painting or even storytelling in New Zealand at that time. I left I left home at the age when I just turned 17. So, but what happened after that and what happened in Australia was our generation was the generation who said, no, we're not British. We want to have our own voice. Now, I wasn't part of filmmaking at that time, but in the 1970s, particularly in Australia and in New Zealand, a generation of my generation were growing up and buying 16mm cameras and making their own films, because Australia and New Zealand did not have art, unlike India, did not have their own film industry. They had, some television, but making an Australian feature film was virtually unheard of. In fact, there was an attitude towards Australian directors that, if you could get a British director, it was better. That somehow, they weren't worthy of making good films. So it was a generational shift where in the 70s, it began what's known today as the Australian New Wave, where there's a whole lot of really, really incredible films were made by very talented Australian filmmakers. One was called Peter Weir, there's Gillian Armstrong, Bruce Beresford, and they made short films to start with, and then they started to make feature films which got to be seen internationally. So it was the rest of the world seeing these films at Cannes Film Festival and other film festivals around the world that said, there's this great talent in Australia making films. Remember, I wasn't part of the film industry at that time, but it's just trying to give you some background to what was occurring. And a number of the films in Australia were saying, in a way, were historical dramas, and many of the ones that became famous were Australians saying to Britain historically, butt out. We are Australians. We have our own voice. And I think there's an Indian film I remember seeing called Lagan. That kind of theme of the cricket match and between the British and that was similar to Australian kind of themes of the 1970s. And there was films like Breaker Morant, to name one of them, that became quite well known internationally, were trying to cut the ties with Britain through culture at that time. But as I say, I wasn't involved at that time making films. I was more involved in the art world and then became the theatre world. But because we did grow up, there was an attitude, which we used to call it cultural cringe, which was our culture was not good enough. Right? And even if you look at Australian plays, it was only until the mid-1950s that the actual Australian accent, the way they speak, or a working class Australian accent, was spoken on the stage in Australia. And they used to send their television, the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the national television or radio at that time, used to send their reporters and their presenters and hosts off to England to study with the BBC of how to talk properly. So
Really?
everybody was speaking proper English. So these shifts happened at that time, and I was part of that generation who was saying, I mean, I do not have British background. I have Irish. So I grew up on mother's side, Irish Catholic, who really disliked the English. So we grew up really disliking. But it was a maturing thing for both Australia and New Zealand to start to have their own cultural voice. But as I say, I was out of there by then, so I wasn't part of that. I was lucky enough to have a history teacher who, I mean, the history that we got was one of the things that really annoyed me. Was we learned more about England than we did about New Zealand, and 1066, and my father used to say, but we have a more interesting history than this. And as a young kid, I used to take a dinner around to a writer who was writing New Zealand history and had struggles getting it published on the Maori Wars and the colonial wars. And so there was a negative attitude towards telling our own stories in those days. So hence, most of my films combine history with this determination to actually tell a story that's left out of history or deliberately left out of history, because we basically didn't get a lot of history when I went to school. That was New Zealand history.
That's common in all British colonies, don't you think? This historical amnesia.
Yeah. Willful amnesia to not know the past. I mean, particularly Australia is different and tougher in that sense than New Zealand was. New Zealand kind of liked being British in a way, but there wasn't what had happened in Australia with the first, colonisation was massacres, terrible massacres, and it's still struggling to come to terms with these terrible massacres. But New Zealand was colonised later after Australia, so it learnt, because of the international condemnation of the British colonisation, not to, have massacres. But, the sort of relationship between, New Zealand, white New Zealanders and Maori is something that's always in conflict still today. That hasn't been resolved as much as the Australian relationship to Indigenous Australians has not been resolved today.
For people who haven't been to Australia or New Zealand and who do not know much history about Australians and Indigenous Australians and Indigenous New Zealand people, can you tell us who are the Aboriginals of Australia, who are the Aboriginals of New Zealand, and what was the conflict? A little bit of history there.
Well, in New Zealand, it was Polynesian, Pacific Islanders who had been in New Zealand for about 1,000 years before British colonisation, were seen as the original Indigenous inhabitants. And the British came, and like Australia, they used the military as in India, with the East India Company, they used the military to actually conquer land and take land away. There was a treaty done with the Maori in the I think the 1840s. But there was a lot of war went on and battles for land. And finally, the British, through sheer force of weaponry, conquered the land. The Maori was seen as the Australian Aborigines as lesser because particularly from the British colonial point of view is they, the white British colonisers were, at top of the hereditary ladder and, grading down to darker races were lower on the ladder, and that was prevalent in these colonies. So as far as Indigenous Australians go, it's now believed the culture goes back at least 65,000 years, and there's plenty of evidence to say that they had been many, many centuries here. And as I was saying before, the initial conquest of Australia was very brutal. In Tasmania, though, for many years they said they'd wiped out the whole of the Indigenous race, which proved to be wrong in the end. But it was a pretty brutal colonisation. But my interest is more in the 20th century because, see, when I wanted to learn about New Zealand or Australia, particularly when I came back in the mid-70s, and I was interested in, well, this is the part of the world I think I belong to, but I was always wanting to read, and I couldn't read anything about, particularly anything on the 20th century about Indigenous Australia, right? Virtually nothing.
Why is that?
It's this part of the historical amnesia. And this meant that even, the situation that I discovered was, and I guess my life took another route than a normal route. After India, I came back. After doing that, and I learned a lot. Having to rely on meeting people in places like Iran and Afghanistan and, teaching English. But I was kind of crazy. I was very confused, particularly after not going to art school. That really affected me because it was my identity. That was who I was. Right? It took me many years to actually be able to feel secure enough to, start writing again and doing art. And I started drinking, bottles of vodka and ended up in the police cell after, I left home. But there was a voice that said, whatever you do, and I don't know where it came from, but luckily I heard it, don't drink alcohol and don't do drugs. And the sense was not that I cared whether they're bad or not. I didn't really know that. But that I was someone that I could destroy myself from it. All right. So there was a lot of questioning in my life. I was suicidal at times. I was pretty depressed at times. Even London was very depressed by it. I couldn't overcome this fear that if I started to write stories and draw at that age, that it'd be taken away from me. And I think that was the effect of growing up in the family where the environment was there was no question of what I was doing, but it was the immediately knowing at the age of 15 that what I was doing was wrong. And so I was pretty angry too. I was pretty confused and pretty angry at the whole, society that sort of said, who you are, which is virtually what I was doing all my life, is wrong. It's not unusual today that I have students that parents will, I say to them, you come to film school and I bet half your parents want you to go into the bank, There is, as an older person, I can see there's a lot of fear about this industry, and it's pretty tough at times, and I've been through some really tough times. But in terms of who I am, I really know who I am now and what I'm doing and what my gifts are. And sitting down in India and drawing, I think I look at those drawings that I did then. I've still got them. I was interested in, these people, these human beings who were on the street, and then they'd wake up. So I saw these drawings, and you just see these shapes on the street, and then they emerge, and the human beings, and the life in New Delhi begins every day. And I was aware that this man had 10 apples, and I was aware that even at that age, that, gee, how would you be able to live if you only have 10 apples? You know, so there's a lot of questions. You know, I sort of looking at life and trying to find answers for myself. I stayed in the Sikh temple in New Delhi. The caretakers sort of, I don't know how I got there, but I lived in there. Oh, I think I've knocked something off. Yeah, and I used to sit in the temple, but I used to go around, just walk around, you know, the Red Fort and that. I didn't know much about the history, but...
Where did you eat?
Oh, you know, well, the good thing is that, you know, the little corner curry house with, you know, a couple of chapatis and whatever they were serving. It was very cheap. So in that way, I was, you know, whatever I had. And as I say, I bought some pencils, and I'd go down, you know, I'd never seen women, you know, carting bricks, you know, and so I was fascinated. And even the way people sit was something you can see in the drawings that I was doing. I was just interested in how people were living. That's been, you know, probably why I've got into documentary. But seeing the Shadow Theatre, I was also interested in theatre and storytelling, and I remember in New Delhi seeing storytellers on the street. I'd never seen a storyteller on the street.
Okay, can you tell us about it? Because in Delhi, I don't know how common is it to see storytellers on the street now.
I think that was in what was called Calcutta then. Well, in those days, it wasn't like it was normal, but, well, there's a wedding passes through on the street, right? And there's music going on the street. Now, that never, ever had something I'd ever seen in, you know, New Zealand or Australia. I think I've always been interested in people. How do people live? So it wasn't... I remember when I first went overseas, and there was an incident that happened that sort of shaped my attitude towards life. Was before I'd gone to England, I'd gone to Bali, the island of Bali, and I'd seen the Wayang, the Shadow Theatre there, which had come from India originally, and Bali is Hindu, and fascinated by that. But also, one day I was watching a funeral procession coming down the street, which was Balinese, and they were carrying these sort of large objects. But what suddenly occurred was there was all these American tourists with these big cameras stepping in front and photographing people and sort of getting in the way, and these Germans used to travel. And I just went over on the side of the hill and sat down. I just felt disgusted at, you know, us Europeans sort of walking over everything and sort of to get the photograph, if you like. And I remember an old Balinese man turning to me and passing me some food. You could obviously see I was upset. But I determined from that time that I would never be a tourist. I would always take something. And so even the drawing in New Delhi on the streets in the morning got me to connect to people of what I was actually doing. This is who I am, right? To draw and to look at people. And sometimes people would take my drawing book and they would do a drawing too. So it's a universal language, like music is. It's a universal language of connecting with people. And so that was something that I believe got me through that journey was drawing, and you know, I can sing too. So, you know, they would have the harmonium in the Sikh temple, although I didn't understand a word they were saying. You know, the music is universal. So I could appreciate the beauty of it. So that's one of the things of India, although it was very overwhelming, it's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly rich and beautiful and enormous depth to it. And you understand there's a long, long history of culture going on here. And of course, as I told you before, I started doing shadow theatre when I came back. So I used to create these beautiful shadow theatres, shadow puppets.
When you talk about shadow theatre, can you explain to us what does it actually mean? Shadow puppeteering as well. What is it exactly?
Well, shadow theatre is shadow puppets. You know, I mean, mine are about that big. They're characters, and there's a debate whether it began in Kerala, and they are extremely beautiful. And they used to use, they probably still do, but traditionally they were made out of hide of a buffalo, which was so fine that they could paint them and carve into them these forms that you could see colour through a screen. So you have a screen and you have the puppets behind and a light behind you. So the light would be behind you and it hits the puppet and it's the audience are on the other side of a screen. It's a bit like a movie.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I learnt a lot of movie making doing shadow puppets, right?
Yeah.
And Kerala, if you see the Kerala puppets, they're just the most beautiful, craft of making Kerala puppets. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was spreading the story of the Ramayana, and Hindu scriptures and stories were a way of telling stories through that. And it would go on, there'd be a lot of improvisation on it. But that's how that culture spread from India down through Indonesia to Bali and around those areas. It also had it in China, and that spread as well. But I was fascinated as a way of storytelling because of the beauty of the puppets, and I made my own. Not that I could afford hide of cattle. I used cardboard and what was a plastic that you could paint on with watercolours. So I became a shadow puppeteer. But I did a play which was based on a French fable at a gallery, and got quite well known. I went to the Opera House and did it, but basically I created about 80 to 100 shadow puppets. Obsessively doing, 12 hours a day, I'd be cutting this fine, I've still got them, fine puppets. But I was asked by us, at those times, the groups like the Turkish or Indian in Sydney were very, very small. We're talking about the later 70s, very small groups. But they experienced racism from white Australians in a place called Newtown, which in those days is now a kind of bohemian.
Yeah, it's very hip.
Well, it was, in those days, it was a place where migrants went to, and it was very working class and very much migrants. But they're experiencing racism, and they knew that I knew about Turkish shadow theatre that I'd seen in Turkey, and they asked me, could I, do some Turkish stories. And the character who is Turkish is called Karagöz. And that had spread from India, so a way of storytelling had spread. I'd always loved to make a documentary about the spread of story from India and coming from China as well, over the Silk routes, across, back through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. And Greece also had shadow theatre, and it ended up in England as Punch and Judy's show. So these transformations took place in the passing of stories. So I made a number of puppets in the traditional form of Karagöz and found that the stories were basically improvised on the story of Karagöz, who was an underdog, if you like, a poor man, and the whole story an improvisation of going out to get his daily bread. And the whole humour of it was how he'd get his daily bread when he, lost his money, had no money. I do have a number of images of these, if on, not here, but on my.
You have to share it.
I can send
you. You have to share it with me.
Yeah.
We'll insert it.
Especially the drawings of New Delhi, and when I looked at them again, I thought, it's because mentally it's still there from that experience of, of New Delhi, and the intensity of it was incredible.
Did you feel that there was some similarity between India then and the Aboriginal cultures in Australia and New Zealand? And they were both colonies. All three of them were
Yes,
colonies as
yes.
well. So that similarity and the Aboriginal
Yeah.
cultures.
I'm trying to think back. One thing that struck me, particularly, remember I met a sadhu on the streets of what was called Calcutta, who had the leopard skin and was sitting on the streets. And his looks very, very similar to Indigenous Australians in the north. I mean, these sort of, I might be rude, but the older more indigenous groups have very similar physical looks to indigenous Aborigines. Because it was the route by which indigenous Australians came to Australia, was that land route over, because it was all, at that time, connected. So it was a land route right to Australia. And that's how they believe they came
Through
here.
India?
Yeah, it would have, yes. Would have come from Africa across land to, and it was all one land mass at that time. And that's how some of the animals came as well. That's what the theory is. Yeah, but that was striking to me. I think the one thing about India is people used to talk, I love talking to people, particularly older people, would say we're passing through a very philosophical age, and the way there's this kind of philosophy in Indian kind of speaking. But I think that connection was there of understanding, coming from an Irish background who lost their farm to England, which means why they got to New Zealand, and also Polish refugees in the 1870s who went to New Zealand and weren't allowed to land because they couldn't speak English and had terrible time from the English when they landed in New Zealand. I mean, it's an incredible story. So I had a mindset that understood India and I also, don't remember that when I grew up, I knew about Gandhi and I knew about the independence movement. That was something that I knew of, that India had gained its independence in the late 1940s. And how it gained its independence is a phenomenal story, with the passive resistance movement. And so that was, India was known to have its independence. And in the 1950s, it was actually criticising Australia quite heavily for its White Australia policy and having some impact on, telling this kind of colonial attitudes that Australia had in those days, that it was way out of line with what was happening in the world, with the independence that was with India and other places in East Asia as well. India was in many ways is a unique place. And as I say, I go to other countries. I haven't been everywhere, but I think that kind of intensity in life is very, very unique to India. And of course, it's phenomenal history that it has. That goes back long time, and many, many changes. But coming back to the shadow theatre, I think because of the beauty of the puppets, I didn't understand the stories because it was in Urdu, being language, I guess. But when I did the Turkish puppets, as I was saying, Karagoose, which is a Turkish puppet, and we wanted to show mainly Australian children that Turkey has a culture. We were trying to say these countries have a culture. Look at the beauty in the storytelling. Through the storytelling, they could appreciate these cultures. And that was at the Newtown Public School at those days. And so I did shows there. But the story of Karagoose is very important because Karagoose goes out to get the daily bread on every show, and it's an improvisation around the problems that he meets of getting his daily bread. And so he'd come up against police. The police would harass him because he was poor. always mistaken to be a burglar or a robber or something, right? Or, he'd come up against, what we'd call welfare people, as children might be taken away. And it was a comic. It was the Turkish Karagöz is a comic satire, and which arose in probably the 14th century. It was the only form of theatre which, under the Ottoman Empire, could exist, because under Islam, theatre couldn't exist. But they allowed Karagöz because they thought Karagöz was just a children's show. In fact, it was actually an adult's, and it was a satire. So it was a way of satirising and making fun of the politics without being caught by the authorities. I love the idea of the whole thing. And I love the idea of making a sort of theatre that you put in a suitcase. And so I did get a couple of, arts grants from the Australia Council to do a bit of a touring around. And I had adult shows, and I'd do children's shows as well. And then I was asked to go to a community, Indigenous communities in the north of New South Wales in the late 1970s. And that was a life changer, that experience. The people who asked me were a group who were taking young Indigenous people who had been in prison or reform school or something like that, and they were getting into trouble. So the theory was, or the plan was, they would take them to see elders in Indigenous Australian groups, communities up on the north of New South Wales, and learn something about Indigenous life that they didn't have in the city, and they were getting into drugs and robberies and, heading in the wrong direction. So this group sort of knew what I was doing with the stories. Now, by that time, I'd made a number of Australian characters. So we sort of evolved the Karagöz story where he arrived as a migrant in Australia and he'd come up against an Australian police. So I made an Australian police, character. And the characters are very much satirical characters, And there'll be a welfare officer, or there'd be, the immigration officer who'd give him a hard time or something. And it was all about how do you get through authorities. And so I arrived on Aboriginal communities, not knowing very much, and put up at night. I'd do the performances at night. I'd set up a tent with the screen I had was quite a big tent, quite a big screen. I'd sit behind it with my shadow puppets. And I did Karagöz. And the interesting thing was that the Aboriginal people viewing it didn't clap, number one. And number two, they totally identified with the Karagöz character, because as darker-skinned Australians, they had a history of coming up against problems with police and welfare and authorities. So they got the humour. And I didn't have any idea, but they got the humour, and they could see through my shows that, I didn't know it at the time. I was the first person that ever gone to these places who was white and performed, right? So I didn't know. And they immediately took me into the house and played songs I'd never heard. And I thought, this is amazing. I've never heard an Aboriginal song. It was a protest song, and I never had met a community, and I thought, this is fascinating, and they sort of adopted me, right? And I didn't quite understand it, because they in those days there was a division between white Australia and Aboriginal Australia, massive division, that the parents of Aboriginal kids would not go to the school. I sort of, was told to leave a couple of white towns because they knew I was performing on Aboriginal communities, and there was enormous racial conflicts going on there, and I'd sort of walked into the middle of it. But in some of the communities, they wanted to revive culture which had been shattered through colonialism. And they saw a way of telling their stories through shadow theatre to the kids, to the children who hadn't heard of some of these stories that had been, virtually nearly killed off by colonialism. And this is the latest 70s, right? So we held workshops and the children would learn from some of them these old stories that were almost from the elders who were going to pass away soon. And they sort of got interested in telling stories. And so I had a video camera, an early video camera, and went down and recorded some of the elders talking about their lives on the cattle stations, the big cattle stations up there in those days, or in the past, or growing up in that world. And then one of the women, Essie Coffey, who was a matriarchal leader of one of the communities, sort of got the idea from what we were doing to make a film, and she became the first Indigenous female director, Essie Coffey. And we made a film, My Survival as an Aboriginal. But it was about her desire that, they could pass on their culture, Murrawari people. But what they were living in were really run down. It was really poor. But I thought, gee, this is a side of Australia I'd never read about or seen or experienced. And I tried to read about it and you couldn't. And people just say, oh, they've always been there. But there was an enormous amount of, like India, there was a lot of things happening. To me, it was a separate culture, that I'd experienced a separate culture in Iran, for instance, and experienced different communities. And I just thought, this is a very separate community. It is not white. It is not, it does not do things the white way, right? And there's something that was, deep and had been long, although my sense, and this was going on feelings, that there was some destruction had gone on between the generations. I didn't know then, but I felt there was a deep kind of splitting between the generations. And I was interviewing some women and they were talking about being apprenticed out or taken away when they were young and having to work on cattle farms and often not being paid. And I interviewed 3 women and every time they talked about it, it was like you could feel this incredible pain. Something had gone on during this time that I didn't know anything about. And I wanted to find out more about it, but couldn't. So I made my second film, which was the first film that revealed what is now known today as the Stolen Generations. Okay, to explain that this is why the 20th century was important, but by 1909, each state in Australia the white government had an act, each state, the 6 states of Australia, regarding Aboriginal people. So they were not recognised as citizens, they weren't given the vote, but they were under the authority of the government as a separate. And the laws, I started reading the law of 1909 in New South Wales called the Aborigines Protection Act, and they were very, very harsh. So the control of Aboriginal people was very, very harsh in the early 20th century, and this went through till the 1970s. So that had only just finished when I'd come to these communities. But one of the things, the major thing that they were thinking in 1909 about Australian Aborigines is that as a race, and this was the same with the Maori, they were going to die out because in white scientific terms, the inferior races die out. And that was still prevalent. That was major theory through the 20th century, that one day Aboriginal people would die out. And they also wanted to break up the communities. They no longer wanted the communities. And also, like in India, they needed a servant class and cheap labour. And what I discovered was what these women were talking about was they were taken by the police from their families when they turned 12 or 13. And they were sent out to work on cattle stations or sent to the cities like Sydney to work as servants to white middle-class families or richer families. And many of them were meant to get paid a sixpence and never got paid this money. So this is something I couldn't read about or no one talked about or know, apart from these elderly women. So I spent the next 3 years trying to learn about it, and the film was a struggle because every time I wanted to, had to go to white, Screen Australia or the Australian Film Commission, it was, and no one would have a clue what I'm talking about, right? Of taking kids away by police and, these terrible breakups of family. The idea was that they would get them away from the families, the elders would die off, and you'd have no more Aborigines. That was the whole plan, right? And that was in law.
To give a little context
Yes.
About the stolen generation, in India we experienced something very similar. There were people from Bihar who were taken away from Bihar, and they weren't told where they are being taken.
Yes.
And they were shipped to countries like Fiji.
Ah.
And for generations, nobody. So if you go to Fiji now,
Yes.
they do speak that Bihari dialect.
Aha.
And
Bihar.
but they don't really know where did they come from, which part exactly about their ancestors and all of
Yes.
that. They just have a rough idea that we might have come from this region, but that is what happened with the stolen generation of India as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was always part of what the British colonising wanted was a servant class. And whites in Australia even, which is not probably known today, is up until probably after the Second World War into the 1950s, many middle-class families had servants. So they were slotted into that. I spent, there was nothing that I could hardly read on it. I spent, months on virtually no money, unemployment benefits, pretending that I was looking for a job. But I went to the Mitchell Library, as the state library, and in those days they have, big volumes of newspapers, and I just go through newspapers to try and find evidence that these things had happened, because there was nothing written about it. The word didn't exist until 1982 with Peter Reid. And also I hadn't had any experience with making a kind of archival film, a historical film. But I went down to Canberra, where they held the Australian Film Archives. And they didn't even have film archives in those days. They had a small one at the bottom of the National Library, which was in the basement, and I could sit at an old editing machine and look through these old prints. So I was trying to find evidence of this occurring on film, for a film, and found, footage which is even used today. And for many, and it was quite exciting because I was the first person who looked at these films and had seen some of these things that had gone on in the past, 1930s particularly. And for me, it opened up a whole new world visually of looking at Australia, and it was telling another side of Australia, which, history still is predominantly written. But I got very interested in the image. And in those days, no one had any interest in Indigenous history at all. I'd go down to government departments and they'd say, "Oh, Aboriginal Australia, why are you interested in that? If you want to find anything, there's these boxes down there and the dusty old boxes," and I could just go and look through them because no one had any interest.
It must be gold for you.
It was, it was the most exciting time to discover that, yes, this went on, and now I have the evidence, because it was also difficult to find Aboriginal people who wanted to speak about it. And if I can explain it this way, although they spoke to me, they knew that I was trusted by the community, therefore they spoke to me. But even then they had a sense of shame or guilt, which we now know in those days, because they had no recourse to actually speak about it, because, racially in those days, if an Aboriginal person spoke or complained, a white person would think or say to another white person, oh, they're just making it up. You don't believe them. That was an attitude. I mean, as being white, I grew up with these attitudes. They were around me. And they'd tell, I'd hear the Abbo. They used to call them the Abbo jokes, the Aboriginal jokes, and they'd, ha, 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 ha. Oh, you heard this one, Alec, ha, ha, ha. And they didn't know that, I was white, right? I'm part of the club. I'm part of the club.
How did you not follow their footsteps? I mean, how did you realize what they were doing was wrong?
Because I grew up next to a library, and my world was a library. I didn't grow up, I was growing up in a bunch of, bigoted racists, tradesmen. I grew up with tradesmen, but I knew more about Picasso and Miro and, books, read War and Peace by the age of 11, like I was totally this quiet kid who never spoke, and I was in the corner reading a book. I had no idea of what the world was about. I didn't know that it was more important to play rugby than, doing what I just, because we also used to do satires on how boring it was to grow up in New Zealand, right? I mean, the one great thing about the British is their comedy. We had these wonderful British satire. They're great at taking the what we call the Mickey out of the upper classes and the aristocrats and the ruling classes, and the humour is very cutting. So I grew up with that wonderful humour, and we used to make up plays, which we'd record on reel-to-reel tape recorders, satirising our upper hut, the people, the barber, and and all these sort of stories that we'd make up about them, because they all pretended that they were all nice people, right? So satire was something that is even in Carragoose, was my attraction to Carragoose. And Aboriginal people have a great sense of humour. I mean, that was a great thing, is the ability to laugh at what's going on around you and, take fun of, the white people, if you like. But white people saw me in those days as a white person, and therefore you tell the Abbo joke, right? So I knew the attitudes, right? I knew the attitudes. So I knew, I suppose I knew what I was dealing with. I wasn't sort of worried about that. And I was pretty angry. I was angry at that time because I sort of thought, well, who are these people who are writing history, which I had a passion for, and leaving out I still today cannot understand Australian society. From 1909 until 1983, when my film came out, no one talked about it. Why was there such a silence? And it's still prevalent in Australia today. It's still very, very strong. Every film that I've made,
it is,
that deals with this subject is really difficult to make. Really difficult. So the film that I made was called Lousy Little Sixpence, and sixpence was meant to be the payment that these women were getting for, every week for being a servant, and they never got this money. And someone used the term, I never got the lousy little sixpence I was meant to get. And not only that, so coming back to why these women didn't want to speak is because we know more about intergenerational trauma. We know more about the effects of trauma, where if a person doesn't have recourse to actually speak about it, or have an opening by which it can be dealt with, they take it upon themselves and blame themselves. I mean, I was doing the same thing. I was actually in the point where I tried to be normal. My life was just a mess when I tried to be normal. I'm hopeless at hammering in a nail, right? I grew up in a family of builders, but, try and get me to hammer in a nail. I can't even turn on a computer.
What is normal?
But that's what I mean, right? But in those days, it was very much a conformist society, right? You fitted in, and if you didn't fit in, and you had a difference. So I could recognise, this community, this Aboriginal community living on the edge of a white town and feeling total outcasts and no separation from it. So I was interested in what their world was and their culture. You know, what was Aboriginal culture at that time, and found that, you know, through that interest, this story about the removal of children, which had a devastating effect on families. So what I was picking up on was this kind of shattering, if you like, that's still been part of the healing today. It's still something that Aboriginal people are trying to connect with each other, as you say, and, you know, people sent to India, from India to Fiji. You'll find in Australia today, you know, Aboriginal people searching for their roots, where they come from. And so it was to me, it was what made me very angry was that I was brought up as a white with these kind of ideals of we were civilized and we have a thing called justice and, you know, we have, you know, decency. And here was blatant sort of something that had gone on which would totally wiped out, not worthy to know about. And so I was driven by a lot of anger at that time about, you know, how dare we, you know, not tell it. But, you know, I mean, I suppose it's the Irish in me. I'm pretty persistent. You have to be a documentary filmmaker. You know, like, you know, we got it made, but the effect was incredible at that time. We even knew, coming back to the women that we spoke to, I couldn't find any women who wanted to talk on camera because one of them said, finally I found a woman who had actually written about being taken away called Margaret Tucker, who was in Melbourne, and she had written this book about the experience of being taken away and the horrifying treatment that she had from these people she went to and how she tried to commit suicide. I took a train down to Melbourne and interviewed her and said, well, she was amazing because she had thought through the whole thing and she was an incredibly beautiful, you know, old woman and spoke most beautiful English and got the train back and thought, that's amazing. And a friend of mine who was a cinematographer, Martha Ansara, had just come out of film school and we'd worked together on Essie Coffey's film previously, My Survival as an Aboriginal. And she said, you've got to go back and film her quickly, you know, you lose this, you know, this generation is about to go. And this was a generation that were taken, you know, in 1920s and 1930s when it was really a lot going on of taking the children away. And so we managed to raise, you know, enough money to all get down there. I made sandwiches for the crew. The cameraman complained that the sandwich was curling up at the end. But we shot this interview because I couldn't get anywhere with trying to get funding, even though I'd done a lot of research and, you know, found photographs and footage and, you know, everything. It was still, you know, people couldn't understand what I was talking about. White people couldn't understand what I was talking about. But when we filmed, Martha had filmed Essie, when she talked about being taken away, the sound recordist, Martha on camera, John was on sound, and me, we were just in tears, right, hearing the story. And we knew at that moment, this is the story from these women that will change people's hearts, if you like. And it was so moving, the way she spoke about being taken away and her sister being taken away and what happened to her mother, you know, afterwards, and the pain of being removed by the police from your parents. And I kind of thought, well, anybody with any humanity would feel for this. And finally, we got 5 people, 4 women and 1 male who were taken away so we could learn their stories. And I came up with an idea of how do I tell it? And at that point, when they had any documentary on Aborigines in those days was kind of don't bother, because none of the TV stations would want to screen it.
That's right.
And so, but I wanted to tell the story differently, which is to have these women because talk to the camera themselves, and we'd put narration in wherever we needed it, but as much as possible they would tell their story directly to camera. Now that had not been done with Aboriginal Australians at that time. And the reason for that is because to connect emotionally with the story, with the audience. And I actually, I'd come from theatre background, so I was toying, was it documentary or drama? But I decided on documentary because no one knew of the story, and it had to come from these people. And my job as a filmmaker would be like a lawyer for the defence, finding the visual evidence that this actually went on. Because as I said, white audiences I knew, they'd turn away and go, no, don't believe them. They just
Not
make these things
interested.
up. No, they just tell lies. Come on, Alec. They're just lying to you. That was the attitude. And so,
Why do you think they just thought they are lying? I mean, even now.
oh,
Why?
I don't know. I mean, it's plain old bigotry, isn't it? I mean, most of the people that are bigots never leave their little communities, wherever they are. I'm talking about white bigots. I mean, the reason why I got out of, Upper Hutt was because of white bigots. Like they're boring people. They never, they'll go to India and go to McDonald's. They're not interested in the world. They're not interested in other people, and so that's why people like Trump can play on race, because they don't go out and see the world. They don't have an interest, but that means they're open to all these attitudes about them. And particularly when the economy goes bad. I remember growing up in New Zealand, and the Maori were good people, but as soon as the economy went bad, as far as whites were going, they're to blame for it, right? So you've got to have a scapegoat in history, and so in many ways, bigotry is that kind of ignorance. It's an ignorant thing. It's a sort of common denominator, if you like, of making a whole group of people be the same, right? Which is because I'd never experienced a group of people. I would come back and tell white musicians, you should go and see Aboriginal musicians. These incredible songs that I've heard, like in English and country influenced. And it wasn't until the late, 10 years after that they started to be heard, but they weren't interested. They weren't interested. Whereas I'd, been to other cultures, and I'd been and seen it. And as I said, I knew that this was a very separate culture, and it had been fractured historically. I mean, these people were living on the land which was now owned by white farmers, but they still had connection to that area, So that splintering. And
the language as well.
Yeah, well, the language is almost gone. I mean, I interviewed one of the last language speakers because the language had almost gone, and the musicologist was recording the language because he was the last who could speak it. Because language was banned, culture was banned, even the idea of an Aboriginal community was going to be something in the past. And I always say to Australia today, if we as whites, our laws, and we carried out their policies, and we didn't have the resistance from Aboriginal people to these policies, we would not have Aboriginal art, the incredible art that exists. We would not have Aboriginal music. We would not have one of the best filmmakers we have in Australia. We would not have this today if we as whites, with our superior intelligence and our brilliance, carried on, it wouldn't exist.
Do you know what? Growing up, I went to a Catholic school for a couple of years, and the rule was you couldn't speak in Hindi or your native language. If you were caught, you would have to pay 5 rupiah, 5 rupees at that time. And who would pay? The parents would pay, right?
Yes.
And then the parents would get scared.
Yes.
So they would push their children to speak in English.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And it was very common in all the convent schools around India. It doesn't matter whether it was in Bengal or Gujarat or Tamil Nadu. It was the same.
Yeah, I think what interests me was how do people, and I guess it's personal as well, how do you survive? Because I went through a period of, honestly, I thought I was going to take my own life. I was very confused. Only years later I understood, how trauma can affect. It doesn't have to be a massive thing for trauma to actually take effect. And I think the ways of surviving personally is why a lot of my work is about resistance or resilience and ways of surviving. And the many stories you would hear about how Aboriginal elders or parents would take their children into the bush to carry on their culture, away from the white missionary. So this was part of what I was interested in, because even in India I had experiences where I'd say it put me back on the road to recovery, like that. I began to understand.
But when you were going through this, mental trauma.
Yeah.
At that time, I don't think people were that accepting about mental health.
No.
The way they are now.
No.
Right?
No.
How did you cope?
Well,
a lot of the times, people just say, this person is just not very resilient. They're just making excuses.
Yeah. Well, that's the same thing they'd say about Aboriginal people, right? Mental health is something. I'm actually a carer today. I've been involved in mental health a fair amount as well.
Oh wow!
And the attitudes, still need there's still a lot of that attitudes. I actually made a film on parents who kept their Down syndrome children. When the hospitals would say, "Leave your Down syndrome children, we'll just get rid of them." And some of the attitudes that exist about people who are, different cultures. So we still live within a world that has, certain attitudes that dominate. And you see a backwards and forwards flow even in Australia and New Zealand, where, the Aboriginal people and their art and culture becomes, recognised, and then there'll be a swing against it, and there's move back and forth continuously about this, and about I've been with people who've had severe, tried to commit suicide and gone to a doctor, and doctors are still saying, "Pull your socks up," and I go, "Hang on, this person's just come out of hospital, and go and get a job, These very simple attitudes, even amongst, professional doctors and highly educated people. I always carry my Dr. Alec Morgan card around and hand it to them so they know, do not try and use that line when I'm sitting here, right? You got to take this seriously.
It's so nice that you are there for all those people, but when you are having those experiences, who was there for you? How did you get through it?
Oh, it's always other people. The sadhu in Calcutta, who I lived with on the streets of Calcutta for a week, I was trying to be a man, right? How do you be, my father was a strong male figure, but I'd totally failed, right, as a male figure in the kind of, so what is a man? How do you become a man? I'm a totally failure at that, right? I'm drawing and writing. I've come from a culture where, building a house is more important. Although I tried to explain it, but there was kind of questions about, masculinity and that. And I remember, I don't know, and because I was close to my mother, I kind of was blaming my mother, and she didn't stand up for me, and so there's a lot of questioning in my head. And I remember the sadhu, I don't know how it got, he was quite short, very, very stocky man. I didn't speak English very much, but he looked at me in the eyes and said, "Not father, first mother. Mother, father, master, God." And that's the first thing he said to me, and I said, wow. It just hit a spot. I thought, what? He said, "Not father, mama. Not father, mother first. Mother first." So that was, so you know, I went into this world that he was living in, and I saw on the streets again that wasn't existing in my culture, a whole culture. That even though I couldn't pick up the language, I could see the gestures, I could feel the interactions when he's talking to people. And he took me around, you know, where they were meditating under the bridge, that big bridge, the railway bridge. I met a whole area of India that probably I'd never even met if I wasn't on that journey, if you like. So I felt I learnt from that experience, you know, that what I was doing, you know, a more feminine thing was really powerful. And so the conflict between feeling that I was doing something wrong or I was the wrong child kind of thing. You know, there were some times when I couldn't even use a pen, you know. But all I can understand, I can't understand the effect it had on me, but I can understand the thing about identity and how shattering, seemingly, the reason why I wouldn't speak about it, because people would say, "Oh, you'll get over it," you know. You could just get over it, Alec, you know. But if I tried to become normal and not do the things that were upsetting me, like drawing and telling story, and become normal, I just went into a depression, and you know, life was just empty. I mean, what am I meant to do? You know, I mean, I did work as a builder's labourer and sort of, you know, I mean, but if you're smart, don't become a builder's labourer. And that's all I can see is, you know, by the time you're 40, you're really screwed, you know, like, but it's, we all exist within human society, right? And we know the conflicts that we deal with, and I deal with in film, conflicts. I mean, I'm a filmmaker, I deal with conflicts. And at the heart of the conflict for the first film was, you know, my first documentary about the stolen generations really had a huge impact on Australia, massive impact. And I was very...
And when you were going through all these experiences, right? What about your siblings? You had two brothers.
Yeah.
You had a sister.
Yeah.
What about them? I mean, did they understand how you were feeling?
No, I never spoke about it. I never ever, I mean, to talk to you now about it, I'd never talk about it. I mean, and it was that kind of thing of, I won't talk about it because they'll just tell you to pull your socks up. Go and get a job. What job? You know, I've tried jobs. I did get a job in London putting handles on suitcases. The most interesting aspect but the most rewarding aspect to the part of me wasn't just to make the money, you know, to go to art school, was the fact that they had this amazing guy who was working in this, making handles on suitcases all his life, and yet he was a painter, and he'd have all these beautiful paintings around the room, the very, very simple but beautiful paintings. And I was fascinated by the person, all right? So I was still fascinated by, even though I had conflicts about it, but now I totally accept that's what I do, right? I'm a storyteller and, you know, it's a visual storyteller. I mean, I have no problem with that now, but there was always, you know, what would be, and I'd read all these wonderful books, you know, I mean, look at the world of books. There's, you know, novels, you know, The Grapes of Wrath, you know, I mean, if I ever want to be inspired now, I'll just go and, you know, read a page of one of the great books, or see an image. I can go to, you know, one of the miniatures, Indian miniatures, and look at them and just see incredible, you know, human attributes that are inspiring, you know. So I just happened to grow up in a colonial society that at that time was stuck, you know, where it was, and it was stuck. Australia was stuck as well, and it sort of gets stuck, right?
Has it moved on now?
No, it hasn't, unfortunately. I mean, we did have an opportunity last year to possibly move forward, and said no. But it's a back and forward thing. But I can't, I won't sit around not doing what I do, particularly I'm getting older. But I did the film after Lousy Little Sixpence, which won lots of awards, but also we had to petition the ABC. We petitioned, we got people to sign a petition asking the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, to screen it. And look, you're never alone in this either. There were many people, because I work from script all the time, I don't have the confidence to make an observational documentary, which is to go out without a script and just observe people. I don't have that kind of I come from a writing side, and that's why I do historical work. So I go out and do the interviews, even with Lousy Little Sixpence. I go out and do the interviews and then, with the research, put it together into a script form. So it's very, very similar to the script in the end that I have. But coming back to the ABC, we had a cooperative of filmmakers, so we're independent like ourselves. And there were a lot of young feminists in those days making great films who couldn't get into mainstream cinemas. Even we were talking about a filmmaker called Philip Noyce, or Phil Noyce, who's now doing Hollywood. They all began with short films. So we were a group encouraging each other and saying, yeah, Alec, just keep going. And I had, sometimes when it get too depressing with Lousy Little Sixpence, I remember going under the dunas, Doona dive, my blankets, and say, oh, no, it's too hard. I can't do this. And my partner...
Doona is a very Australian word.
Yeah, Doona.
It's a very Australian word.
Doona dive.
It's a blanket.
A Doona dive means when you're feeling down or you don't want to face the world anymore, you go under your bed and you pull the covers over your head. And I was doing that.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, I can't make this film. I just can't do it. And my partner at the time, Rosie, came in and looked at me with this and said, well, are you going to lie there all week or are you going to get up and make this film? And she said it in such a way, I said, okay, yeah, I'm out of here. I'm working.
I think we should all thank Rosie. We have to thank Rosie for motivating.
She was like, you're going to lie there and moan and feel sorry for yourself, or you're going to get up and do this thing. I never looked back. I remember the first screening of it. The interesting thing was that because I'd been connected to these communities, I was, I've had a lot of different experience to many white Australians. Many, that experience was very different where, by taking an art form in, by the shadow theatre, they could see who I was, right? I didn't realise that, the only other whites they see, and this is the problem of many Aboriginal communities, the only whites that enter into some of these communities are like the police or the welfare or the magistrate or, or the tradesperson to fix up the houses. They don't get ideas. They don't get artists coming in. They don't get these refreshing kind of differences coming in. And to them, particularly, culture was very important. And reviving their culture is still important. So I felt I was I never felt when I was making that film that I was an individual artist. And this is a difference I sort of saw, that, we see the artists as, Gauguin or, as an individual. I actually felt when I was making that film, I was part of a community. And that I was very much trying to get their story across, and I was trying to use whatever skills I had to try and get their story across. And I believe the film still lives with the emotional heart that they brought to the story. And, my job was to find and put together the whole thing and, find the money. So those kind of things I was aware of, and also that Aboriginal people in those days, even in the early 80s, were saying quite clearly, and they're still saying it quite clearly, we want to have our own voice. I mean, this is 40 years ago. They were saying, we know the situation, we live with the problems on our communities every day, and yet we're getting people from the outside coming in, policing us, telling us what to do, bureaucracies running our lives. We know what to do. Yes, we will make mistakes, and yes, it will cost money, But in the end, we need to work out what is best for our people. And still today, there was an opportunity for that to happen last year with the Voice referendum. White Australia said no. So we're back. Probably worse than it was before. Yeah. So it's not.
And what was the reason?
They don't want to give power